Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today. We are connecting from Taipei, Madrid, Buenos Aires, Santiago, and many other places around the world. Before we begin, please note that today's event is being live streamed on the official YouTube channel of Taipei Fine Arts Museum, and it will remain publicly accessible. So if you have any questions or wish to edit anything out afterwards, please contact the museum staff using the email that we are going to post it in the chat now. Okay, so let me introduce a bit myself to you first. So my name is Shang Yun. I'm a digital art curator and dance filmmaker with a background in philosophy and sociology. And I will be your host and moderator for today. And yeah, Yuening, I think maybe you can also pin myself in the main video call now for the audience. Okay, so let me introduce you. Like, this program is part of the Net Open platform at Taipei Fine Arts Museum. This is a project that aims to establish a space for integrating online and offline exhibitions that engage with internet and digital cultures. And today's event is connected to a project called www.counterarchive.commons. So this project is playing with this concept of a broken and disappearing URL aligned with our annual curatorial theme, that is commoning. So one of the central questions we explore in this co-creation process is how can art become a kind of commoning infrastructure, so to speak, and how can visibility, accessibility, and preservation be extended to cultures often excluded from traditional archive. So like those lacking the resources to have an archive as a center for symbolic and epistemologic power. So the question is, like, what forms can counter archives take to represent the repressed and marginalized voices of others? And so we are making a physical exhibition in Taipei and also like online event like today, that we are turning the exhibition into a counter archive. And this is like a starting point for deconstructing archival politics. And we bring together artists from all over the world who use their bodies and community-based technologies to create alternative archives. And we are thinking about how to reflect on the patriarchal infrastructures and seek to decolonize the dominant narratives shaped by cultural imperialism and colonialism and platform capitalism. So today's event is called Performing Fragile Archives, a Perspective from Latin America. We features a lecture performance created by Daniela and Julia, and followed by a lecture titled The Internet is Not an Archive, but a Performance by curator and researcher Doreen. Today, we will explore the politics of fragile archives and how performative and community-based archives could serve as a possible commoning infrastructure for our shared colonial history and digital futures. And now, Daniela and Julia, the floor is yours. You can introduce yourselves to the audience first.
Thank you so much, Xianyun. Thank you to all the staff in the Taipei Fine Arts Museum. Julia and I were very happy to be here. I'm connecting from from Santander in Spain, and Julia is in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She's in an event with more people who will be looking and watching us now. So we're very happy as well that we could organize this event there. Just shortly before sharing with you our work, once that Xianyun invited us to participate of this project, it was very important for us. Myself, I'm a curator and cultural practitioner, and Xianyun and I had already collaborated in another project related to net art in Latin America. So I see this as a continuation of our research and collaboration between historiographies and contemporary art in Latin America and Taiwan. So it's very important for us to continue with these partnerships and to see what happens and all the activity and research that takes place in the so-called peripheries. So yeah, I think for us it's important that before continuing the conversation, you can see the lecture performance, which is called Las Fuerzas del Suelo, or the Forces of the Ground. And yeah, well, I will share it now.
Rather than consider distance as a loss of sound information and environmental reflections as the scrambling of a direct signal, powerful contextual experiences invite one to reverse this point of view, to apprehend movements of sound not in terms of what they take away, but in terms of what they contribute to the vibration. Pali Mersault. Dear audience, dear viewers, dear receptors spread in the distance of the internet network, or maybe present in the museum, thanks for joining us in Las Fuerzas del Suelo, the Forces of the Ground, a lecture performance which is a dialogue across places and across times. I'm here today to present a navigation through personal or domestic and institutional or more than institutional archives. A very personal filter of inexhaustible collections of sound and visual material created in dialogue with and following Julia Rossetti. This is Julia.
Soy de la ciudad de Corrientes, ubicada al nordeste de Argentina, una sociedad fundada bajo el mito en torno a una cruz milagrosa, en un territorio rodeado de humedales y ríos como el Paraná, que hacen fluir aguas de tierras lejanas y que a su vez configuran límites políticos con otros países. Inicié hace algunos años un viaje que me llevó a desembocar hasta el final de estos ríos y llegar a donde hoy se ubica la ciudad de Buenos Aires, capital del país. En el camino, empecé a inventar rituales y construir mi propio sistema de símbolos, métodos para no diluirme, para no olvidar de dónde vengo e intentar hacer frente a lo que implica migrar. Empecé a sostener el ejercicio de registrar imágenes y sonidos de allá y de acá y de allá. Un cúmulo desclasificado de archivos digitales fue creciendo. Fue entonces que el Centro de Arte Sonoro se convirtió en mi puerto, un espacio dedicado tanto al sonido como a la escucha, que abrazó una inmensidad de proyectos y artistas, convirtiéndose en un lugar de innumerables intercambios con la comunidad local e internacional. Espacio que transformó también mi práctica en lo formal y lo afectivo, A partir de esta experiencia, parte de mis colecciones de sonidos se cruzaron, conformando una serie que reúne grabaciones de campo de diversos y variados acontecimientos sociales, cuyo lugar común es el tambor y el canto, frecuencias que hacen vibrar los cuerpos y la tierra en la ceremonia colectiva de las fuerzas del suelo.
The interiorization of the place can also be sought in the image of the body, that which is born in the place and which dies, prolonging the memory of the place of birth, a complex operation which speaks at the same time of the most distant literature and the closest landscape, and which would affirm, I carry my zone with me. CASo stands for Centro de Arte Sonoro in Spanish, which would translate to English as Center of Sound Art, an arts initiative in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the city where Julia lives and where I used to live. It hosted for various years sound art events, conferences, performances, and was also the main location for Radio CASo. Radio CASo is an online radio station that has served as an archival structure for many of the encounters that took place in the center. It also served as an excuse and platform to generate many other events and content. On its website, the radio is introduced with the following line: Radio CASo broadcasts 24 hours a day from anywhere with internet access. Nicolás Warchowski, an artist who created the Archivo País and one of the people who insisted on the importance of the continuation of the CASo archives, stated, "The radio became portable in both directions, opening up the possibility of initiatives within easy reach, opening up to a community construction."
Me llegó al corazón y nunca lo olvidaré.
¿Estás escuchando la radio o no?
Siendo las 19:01 de la tarde en Buenos Aires, estamos transmitiendo por primera vez Radio CASo desde Argentina para América Latina y resto del mundo.
En todo caso, uno de los vaivenes del archivo podría ir entre el documento y la ficción.
Archivo País es un proyecto de ficción institucional.
Pretendemos con esta exposición retornar al cuerpo y hacer una reflexión sobre lo tangible y sobre todo aquello que nos atraviesa.
Que siempre nos convoca la muerte, el duelo, ¿no? La melancolía, la tristeza, y subvertir estos sentimientos y hacerlos en procesos creativos enormes.
Julia created that trailer and navigation of the archive of Radio CASo, in which she takes us through some of the main programs and exhibitions that she had the opportunity to work on during her time there. The story of this center and this radio is a story of intermitencias, with moments of public institutional support and other moments when it was completely self-managed by its founders and other members, who had to take charge of it in order to resist losing the material. The story of Radio CASo is just another example of the fragility, adaptability, and resilience that is present in our cultural productions. How do we understand, or how do we even name an initiative that during some periods receives public funding and during others it just floats and resists in a limbo supported by individuals? Why is it even important or interesting to categorize a structure like this, which is under constant transformation, depending on which way the wind of the governing party seems to be blowing? I guess, finally, the most important question is this: what are the underlying gestures in all this? I pose this question here, understanding the concept of gesture as the choreographer and theorist Marie Bardet does. Gestures are modes of relation rather than a mere bodily form. a style for using a technique in a certain way, or rather a style alongside a technique. So I wonder, what were the gestures that created an archive like this?
Está mal, porque todo eso habla de la fragilidad. Y no. ¿Por qué tenemos que ser frágiles? No, porque después, ¿entendés? Das una clase y ¿qué ejemplo pasas de obras de los que sí guardaron las cosas? ¿No? Y después querés leer a alguien y todo es así, ¿entendés? Entonces, eso está mal, no tengo ninguna duda de eso. Hay que guardarla. Quiero decir, ustedes están haciendo un trabajo muy valioso y además, quiero decir, no sé, muchas, si no todas, de las cosas que ocurren en el ámbito, por ejemplo, del Centro de Arte Sonoro, son cosas hechas para el Centro de Arte Sonoro. Entonces, quiero decir, no tienen otra vida, no se mostraron antes y bueno, claramente no van a tener la oportunidad de volver a mostrarse si no se documentan, se guardan, no sé. Entonces, está mal, alguien se tiene que ocupar, tiene que ser parte del equipo, de una cosa lógica. Que hoy, no sé, sacar una foto, no sé, tomá, foto, ya está, guardala.
Yo estoy de acuerdo.
No, bueno, no sé.
¿En dónde la guardamos? ¿Qué nombre le ponemos? ¿Y en qué carpeta?
Esos son detalles apasionantes de la vida archivística, pero...
De hecho, los archivos, las teorías archivísticas están pensadas para las instituciones en funcionamiento, no para descubrir cosas en cuartitos.
Claro, porque no es solo lo que pasó, es lo que va a pasar.
Claro.
¿No? Digo, si tenés una mínima proyección a futuro, es lo que va a pasar lo que hay que guardar.
Exacto. Es la posibilidad de ese pasado, que de la que hablabas antes vos.
Exacto.
Pero en ese camino, en el de guardar y en el de cómo guardar...
O sea, el pasado es el universo de lo posible.
Okay, so it's not okay to be fragile? Or what Nicolas Warchowski is referring to is how exhausting and frustrating it is to see how Western history, with capital H, only mentions artists and projects from certain regions of the world that had the infrastructure to archive and preserve. The past is the universe of the possible. The capacity to register, organize, and preserve an archive also means having the capacity of a past, or of many pasts, in the future.
Para mí, sí, entiendo lo que decís y me parece que es obvio y lógico que tiene que haber un archivo institucional, sobre todo en entidades públicas. Ahí ya hay una responsabilidad que existe y que debería cumplirse. Pero también pensaba, cuando estaba tratando de lucubrar cómo generar el archivo del Centro de Arte Sonoro, lo pensaba como un instrumento de gubernamentabilidad, digamos, como una cosa externa a mí, persona, que soy el único factor común entre 2017 y hoy del Centro de Arte Sonoro, digamos, que pueda dar cuenta de qué pasó, cuándo pasó, con quién pasó, de qué manera pasó.
Fundamental, pero perdón.
Y entonces ahí está el ejercicio para mí interesante que decía al principio, o que a mí me estaba conflictuando y que claramente hay que hacer, pero bueno, hay que conseguir los medios para hacerlo, y el tiempo, el espacio, y el material del archivo, que el ejercicio que me está costando mucho y que me parece que quería traer a esta mesa con todas estas preguntas y me encanta recibir respuestas, que es transformar lo propio en impropio y generar un archivo que permita a la vez una fuerza instituyente del Centro de Arte Sonoro, pero que de alguna manera dé cuenta de esta situación más doméstica en la que fue generado y cómo se gestionó, que permita también estas fuerzas destituyentes, una institución que se permita cambiar,
sí, me parece importantísimo.
Entonces, en esa tensión entre lo doméstico y lo institucional, entre lo propio y lo impropio, creí, y viendo cómo trabajaste el archivo País y la muestra acá, empecé a pensar que quizás la forma que tenga que tener este archivo sea más parecida a un archivo doméstico que a un archivo institucional, a un álbum de fotos familiar, que dé cuenta de esos lazos y las relaciones que en principio pensábamos incapitalizables, pero capaz que tengan su forma también. Pero no me parece que sea un ejercicio de aplicación como, bueno, agarrar las fotos, poner no sé qué, eso es el archivo del caso. Sí, eso está, eso existe, eso, qué sé yo. Pero o sea, generar un archivo que permita múltiples narraciones y no solo la mía, la propia, se me presentó como una dificultad, básicamente. Y no soy archivista y no pretendo ser archivista.
Yo tampoco, lo que quiero aclararlo. Yo soy artista, digamos.
Claro, yo también.
In between an institutional archive and the family album? An archive that was created in a more domestic context, an archive that is presenting itself in between the domestic and the institutional. An archive that is possible thanks to the insistence, tenacity, and patience of individuals. An institution that allows itself to change through the different narratives that the archive allows. We're talking about something that surpasses and overflows what we know as an archive. The Chilean author Maximiliano Tejo has come with a concept that we think could help us understand this situation. The concept is anarchivism. The anarchivist movement is neither revolutionary nor traditional, neither instituting nor conservative, for it does not seek to refound or simply finish with files, but rather to finish with their hierarchical organization, with the dual principle of the archive coupled to the state machine, that is, with the mythical beginning and the sovereign mandate. Anarchivist assemblages tend towards an organization that does not put the organs of the collective body in a hierarchical order, that is, that does not reproduce the hierarchies of the police order of the archive, deactivating its technologies of classification and identification. Instead, anarchivist assemblages express a creative potency of common support for the self-governance of the space of inscription, of effects, bodies, and their information, simultaneously generating new modes of political subjectivation, technologies of expansive redistribution, and the collective management of resources. With the Radio CASo, we're talking about the management of mainly sound, experimental music, the creation and sharing of knowledge and voices of practitioners from a whole region, not only from Argentina, but Latin America. There is a level of classification and identification which makes it accessible to others, which allowed us to create this navigation and share it with you. Accessibility is another of its key points. You can access, listen, and download all the material of Radio CASo through the Internet Archive, a non-profit digital archive.
Volvemos a marchar a la Plaza de Mayo, nuestra plaza, como se está haciendo hoy a lo largo y ancho del país. Una vez más llegamos con las fotos de quienes fueron víctimas del genocidio. Sus ausencias nos siguen doliendo, pero traemos en alto sus banderas, sus rostros, sus nombres, sus historias, sus vidas y militancias, y los hacemos presentes.
The past is the universe of the possible. When we record real sounds, when we take the recorder out into the street, we go out like hunters seeking to capture what by definition vanishes in the very gesture of its existence. Perhaps because as documentarists or soundscapers we are nostalgists trying to protect life from the threat of oblivion. Perhaps because as nostalgists we have become fascinating with the power of documenting, recording, converting something that happens and evaporates into something revisitable in the future. Because we want to perpetuate the evanescent.
pero estamos tan seguros de que sabemos lo que queremos. Quiero decir que a veces no sabemos lo que deseamos. Y ese sonido no deseado puede ser de golpe un objeto de deseo, y es ahí donde toda esta oposición, ruido versus silencio, ruido versus sonido, en el fondo todas estas polaridades están como un poco agarradas con pinzas, ¿no? Son todas inestables. Tenés la guerra y la paz, el bien y el mal, si uno supone que la paz es el bien y la guerra es el mal, y el silencio que es el bien porque es la paz y entonces está del lado, pero todo eso se puede dar vuelta de golpe. Alguien, creo que Alan lo dijo, el silencio tiene una idea de que es la paz, justamente es lo que buscamos, pero en realidad cuanto más leemos sobre silencio, más hay una tensión crítica, es decir, el silencio es el silenciamiento, como él decía, es la ausencia de la expresión, es la muerte, o sea que todas estas categorías son reversibles en el fondo.
The archive can exist as a regime of domination, of cohesion and control of narratives. Drawing on Mayra Esteves Trujillo's research, we can understand how sound has also been an element of control, violence and subjugation since the colonial process in Latin America. But in the same way that the archive is surpassed by anarchivist strategies, which allows us to generate other forms of subjectivation and community practices, sound has also enabled practices of healing and resistance. Drums and voices are the sound objects that Julia mentions are present throughout all her collection of personal recordings. The drum and the gritas, referring to the chants, are present in these collective claims and celebrations in what the Ecuadorian theorist Mayra Esteves Trujillo calls macerados sonoros, which we could translate to English as a sound maceration or sound mash. These are sound macerations of resistance and indignation. In Mayra's words,
veo que estas formas en las que tenemos las sociedades de protesta sonora, en donde está interpelándose como varios espacios que además quiero recalcar no son decoloniales, sino más bien anticoloniales, y que van también surgiendo en una suerte de macerado sonoro, ¿no? Que tendría que ver con digamos, esta forma en que de manera histórica han ido constituyéndose procesos que han resistido desde lugares, desde pueblos y nacionalidades, y en este ámbito, desde esta tradición, vuelven y también se resemantizan en el presente.
Drums, a sound object of ancestral presence on our continent, linked to colonial violence and slavery, but which has persisted into our present in many ways. Drums of many kinds in each of our countries, combined with kitchen pans in Argentina to denounce the numerous economic crises that we go through. To show indignation understood as a categorical possibility of pointing towards utopian contexts in the face of dystopia. Our chants, our bodies, with different sound objects create what we can call social percussiveness. Social percussiveness is the impact of different bodies on each other, as well as the social and physical manifestations of the musical practices. Percussiveness can also be defined as impact, and social rituals greatly impact human behavior and our interactions with each other. The different bodies can include other people, the environment, technology. Social percussiveness is for us another way of talking about las fuerzas del suelo, the forces of the ground. That moment in which the individual body becomes a collective body. That moment in which our bodies as vibration instruments resist, celebrate, record, narrate and surpass the possibilities of the present. social percussiveness is also the possibility to impact you, wherever you are, and the possibility for you to impact us.
Nueva edición de Patio Sonoro. Nueva edición de Patio Sonoro.
Thank you very much for this lecture performance. I must say that the first time when I watched the video, I was crying really hard because I feel like it's a great cultural loss if this center and the archive is going to disappear. And now we are going to welcome our next speaker, Doreen. Her lecture title is "The Internet is Not an Archive, but a Performance." Maybe Doreen can say hi to the audience, and I'm going to share the video.
Yes, hello everyone. I am actually right now in San Diego, which is very early. So I decided to also record my presentation, and hopefully afterwards we will be able to talk a little bit more. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Doreen Rios, and I'm going to be presenting the talk titled "The Internet is Not an Archive, but a Performance" today. I am very, very happy to be in such good company, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and the Q&A after this brief talk. Well, I have been working as a curator and as a researcher, particularly focusing in media arts for the past 10 years. And I am also the founder of Antimateria, which is an online platform dedicated to the research, exhibition, and I would say the space for convergence for digital arts with a specific focus on Mexico. And currently I am a PhD student at the University of California in San Diego. I am doing some research on the histories of media arts, again, in Mexico. So that's my field of specialty. But today I bring to you this conversation in regards to the internet, archives, performatic practices, gestures, anarchivism, and some other ideas as well that hopefully will make sense in the context of this program. So just to start off with some key ideas, I'm gonna, get rid of this. And before delving into the internet and anarchivism and other practices that deal with digital materiality, I want to tell you a story. So when we think about archives, of course, we tend to consider this specific kind of materiality around archival practices, right? And it has to do with hegemonic powers, and it has to do with gatekeeping, and it has to do with being able to put together a logic behind the categorization of content that has been deemed relevant or that has been deemed important by whatever hegemonic power it is that we have in mind. But how many of these archives come into existence really has a longer story, and obviously not such a linear one. So I want to tell you a story about the agrarian archive in Mexico, right? So the Agrarian Archive is one of the most important national archives in Mexico, but it emerges from a very peculiar part of history that I want to share with you. So, in order to do that, we would have to jump back into the 1910s. So, during the 1910 in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution started. The Mexican Revolution, let's say generally speaking, it looked for the two things mainly, right? So first of all, the Mexican Revolution was very much against or very much about overthrowing the dictator at the time, who was Porfirio Diaz. But on the other hand, it was very much about an anti-colonial practice, or a decolonial practice rather, that strived for giving back land to the people. And by the people, obviously they meant workers, but also they meant the people who actually worked the land, the people who got, in a way, stripped from their property due to the fact that it wasn't part of an official institution, or it wasn't really embedded within any quote-unquote official structure of the Mexican government at the time. So the Mexican Revolution is very much a workers' revolution, and it's very much a revolution that looked into territory and that looked into giving back or redistributing the resources in this case, right? So what are we looking at in here? This is mainly a part of the head of the Mexican Revolution. So these are some agents, these revolutionary agents who created or made a space to guide and direct bits and pieces of this revolutionary process. Who we have here right in the middle is one of the key figures of the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata. And Emiliano Zapata is a very interesting character, particularly within this history of archival practices and how to jump into, let's say, or to decolonize an archival practice that was being put into play, particularly at that moment in time in Mexico. So when we think about it, there are two, let's say there are two main phases of the Mexican Revolution. The first half of the Mexican Revolution was very much about overthrowing Porfirio Diaz, which was fulfilled and accomplished, and the new president was Francisco I. Madero. So Francisco I. Madero, a former revolutionary, eventually gets into power, and he was supposed to fulfill all the needs of the revolutionary movement, but he was failing to do so. So what happened when he got into power and he failed to deliver what he promised, or he failed to pursue the interests of the revolutionary movement, that's when the second phase of the Mexican Revolution started to happen. And this second phase of the Mexican Revolution was triggered by a very, very important document that's called the Plan de Ayala. So here's a bit of an extract, chopped image, if you will, of this plan. But what I found very important to look into right here is this particular quote by drafted by Francisco I. Madero, all together with his fellow revolutionary partner, Otilio Montaño, right? So it is the one that's here. It says, Francisco y Madero is humiliating in blood and fire Mexicans who want liberties, so as to please the scientists, landlords, and bosses who enslave us. Obviously, this is just a very, very small excerpt of the Plan de Ayala, which looks into other fields and specifics about what they are trying to pursue in this second half or the second phase of the Mexican Revolution. But something that I find very revealing about this particular quote right here is that although they are pointing towards, or they are in a way going against the scientists, the landlords, and the bosses, that doesn't mean that they are running against the notion of science, property, or labor, right? Really what they're looking at in here is to make a space to get rid of some of these hegemonic figures, or these figures who hold the power to decide what gets to be deemed as science or knowledge, who gets to own property, and who gets to benefit from workers' labor, right? So what I find very, very compelling here is that we could very well add to this list, let's say the archontes, if we were to look into ancient Greece, right? Those who get to choose what is relevant enough, what is important enough to be archived. So what they are really challenging with the Plan de Ayala is the fact that these figures who hold the power to decide who gets to, again, create knowledge, benefit from labor, and own property are, well, very much corrupted agents, right? So they are pointing against these corrupted agents that get to choose, that get to decide who does what and who benefits from what. And this is very, very interesting because once the second phase of the revolution is accomplished, right? Again, one of the main slogans of all of the revolutionary process was Tierra y Libertad, so land and freedom. And it really had to do with giving back the lands to the people. And this is an interesting thing, not only because it's very, I guess, it's very present even to this day to think about returning land to the people. And it's a big, big part of all of the decolonial studies that are put together and the critical theory that is being put together in the past 50 or so years, right? And it remains to be something that is very much relevant. But what happens here, right? And I love this. I love this mural by Diego Rivera, Man at the Crossroads, because it's very much about that. And even though, of course, Diego Rivera is not part of the Mexican Revolution, he's very much looking into, let's say, what the revolution or the revolutionary movement in Mexico accomplished, which is returning the goods or rethinking and reshaping what we understand as labor, as property, and as knowledge. And what I mean by this, and just going back in order to keep in track with all of the ideas about the archive, is the fact that once the Mexican Revolution gets in a way fulfilled or is accomplished by the second phase of the revolutionary movement, the way in which they take care or look into these new forms of retrieving or reshaping or reconsidering the ways in which we're going to give the land back to the people is through developing the agrarian archive. This agrarian archive is one of the most important archives of Mexico. And it has, you know, a little bit of everything. So we can find things that look like this. So some maps, we can find some demarcations, you know, some limits, some, let's say, quote unquote, borders, whether natural or artificial. But we can also find images. We find pictures of people who gave these pictures and all of these documents to the then Mexican government in order for them to prove who owned what, or to, in a way, make a case for stating which lands belong to whom. And what is very, very interesting about the Agrarian Archive is that it is made out of all of these documents that belonged to families, to individuals, to very, let's say, quote unquote, smaller agents or smaller entities who eventually become part of this bigger or larger power. And something that I find very interesting here, that it's not as well known as, I guess, as it should, is the fact that 51% of the land in Mexico belongs to indigenous communities, and it's very much taken care of, or in a way governed by the local indigenous laws. And this is possible particularly due to the fact that the Agrarian Archive exists. Why? Because this Agrarian Archive is the one that shows how this land ownership works, right? It holds all of the documents, signed or otherwise, that show the ways in which these lands are divided and who owns them and who can work around that, how can you redistribute them. And in many, many ways, again, it looks into the specific ways in which families and communities decide to go about property and land usage. Again, this is obviously not to romanticize all of the issues that come with this, and obviously the ways in which this has benefited other agents, particularly neoliberal agents and imperialist agents in recent years. But the thing is that these documents or these memories that didn't used to be considered something that was powerful or relevant or important in any way before the Mexican Revolution, they eventually get consolidated as one of the most important national archives. And again, this is just to give an example of the performativity of the materials of an archive and the ways in which an archive can be configured and can be reshaped and can be rethought throughout time, regardless of the materialities that encompass it. So this is, again, not a perfect science in any case, but I think it does allow us to give a space for opportunity to consider the ways in which archives have been conformed throughout history, right? And the ways in which archives can be rethought now that we have other tools at play, particularly tools that allow us to have a different approach to these materialities and to really think about a decentralized practice of keeping and saving archival objects. And again, since this is obviously not a perfect science, I would love to keep in mind or to bring to the conversation this fantastic quote by Mariana Botey, who states that for the colonizing logic of capital, there is no psychic urgency, subjective dissidence, antagonistic historical formation, critical genealogy, sacred dimension, supernatural phenomenon, natural reserve, sanctuary of endangered species, genetic code, artificial intelligence system, illicit substance or illicit act, active memory, etc., that is not likely to become a material resource and a commodity in the circulation of capitalism in its cognitive phase, a phase that contains all the phases in an integrated and functional way: mercantile capitalism, industrial capitalism, financial capitalism. This quote right here, I think it summarizes, right? It summarizes the issue of having, in this particular case, and just to keep in track with the topic, to keep in track or to pursue an archival practice that is able to escape some of these colonizing logics, right, throughout time. And that is at the same time something that is stable and that remains unmovable throughout history. And this is obviously a big, big, big challenge when we want to think about archival practices that fall outside the categories of the traditional archive, or that fall outside the categories of an institutionalized archival practice that allows for certain resources to keep an archive alive, right? Obviously, what we see nowadays, and particularly within the conversation around archival practices and the internet, is that it seems to me that sometimes we want to replicate exactly the same model of an archive that lives outside of the screen, but online, right? We still want to have this logic of structuring an archive that follows a very specific pattern, that allows for very specific ways of accessing it and of using it. And of course, also that limits the ways in which other people could be using or could be informing or even adding up to this archive. And I think that that is a space for possibility. So in order to pursue that, maybe we have to pose a question, right? What do we do when we don't want to perpetuate? What do we do when we don't want to perpetrate this colonizing logic of hegemonic powers being the ones that determine archival practices, particularly when these archival practices could fall into the dissident category, right? Or could fall into a category that really wants for others to make active use of these archival practices. In a way, what we would look into, or one of the potential answers to that question could be to think about it not as an anti-archive practice, but as an unarchival practice, right? And in order to do that, I would like to bring to the conversation, or to bring to the table, this fantastic research and proposal made by Andrés Maximiliano Tello, who says that anarchivism should then be understood as a movement that goes through heterogeneous social mutations, peasant and worker rebellions, student and feminist struggles, indigenous and popular revolts, since in all these experiences of collective agitation operate assemblages of bodies, affects, and technologies that alter the registers of identities, positions, and functions labeled in the social machine that distributes the general production of the body and the corpus on the surface of inscription that we call reality. And this brings me back to the agrarian archive that I was talking about earlier in this conversation. In a way, the story behind the agrarian archive is very much the story of an anarchivistic practice, right? It is very much about, in this particular case, an indigenous and popular revolt that requires the reassembling or the rethinking of the notion of, in this particular example, land and property, labor and freedom, that were very much sustained by the community, the revolutionary communities, and that were eventually upheld, or that were eventually absorbed by a larger structure that reshaped reality. In this case, the agrarian archive that allows to give evidence of how the land is being redistributed, to whom and why, right? And even though today we can say that this now has become this very well-structured and traditionally structured archive, that doesn't mean that it should remain like that forever. And that is really what Andrés Maximiliano Tello is telling us here, right? An anarchivism practice, or an archivist practice, really is about understanding the flexibility of the archive. It's very much about giving it the fluidity and giving it the malleability that an archive requires in order for it to become indestructible, in order for it to be able to reshape reality, but to reshape reality in such a way that allows for these, let's say, other forces, other new forces, or other new changes to be accomplished and acknowledged within the very structure or the very idea of the archive. And here is where I would say that the internet comes into play, right? So, historically speaking, we can say that, we can ask the question, of course, what does the internet have to do with it? What does the internet have to do with an archivist practice? How does the internet can allow for us to pursue this, right? And I just wanted to share with you and to put together some of the metaphors or some of the ways in which we have historically referred to the internet without calling it the internet, right? Some of them have to do with calling it a macro repository, an archive, collective mind, a global village, a military tool, the cloud, computer networks, cyberspace, the metaverse, network of networks, global fabric, or informatic mycelium. I think it is very interesting because obviously the internet has changed a lot throughout time, and one of the big mistakes that we should not fall on, right? One of the big fallacies of the internet, particularly of the early internet, is about the fact that the internet is forever, number one, and then the internet could be seen or could work as a public space. Really, the internet is very much a private space, right? It's co-opted, at least in the West, by very big and very specific monopolies. In this particular case, we can see that with Amazon, Meta, and Google. These are the three big monopolies, the three big monsters, right? That hold most of the inner internet, at least within the open internet. So we shouldn't necessarily fall into that category just because it is not necessarily the internet per se as a technology that would allow for this anarchivistic, fluid, malleable practice, performatic gesture, if you will, to emerge. But actually, what will allow for that to emerge is, on one hand, the materiality that it upholds, which is a digital materiality, and on the other hand, the ways in which we can internally restructure and reconfigure the ways in which we understand the internet and how to go about it, right? So in terms of the digital materiality, really what we have to keep in mind is that digital materiality is very much a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, right? Trying to break it down to simple terms, digital materiality is made out of the same thing. In this case, up until this day, it's very much composed by zeros and ones, regardless on whether that will eventually become an image, a video, a piece of code, a sound, text. It doesn't really matter. In the end, everything is made out of the same clay, and this clay is a constitution, a configuration of zeros and ones arranged in several ways that allow for these other formats to appear, right? By formats, I mean still image, video, and so forth. And this, obviously, this fluidity, this very liquid and aqueous way, elusive materiality, elusive, let's say, matter that flows in a specific kind of way, particularly throughout the internet, it has allowed for various strategies to emerge. But again, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the fact or the early promise of the internet. It has to do with the ways in which we have hacked and reworked this promise of the internet. And before jumping into some of the examples that I think really accomplish this unarchival practice, if you will, from within the internet specifically, I would love for you to have a look at this very small, very simple diagram. This is a peer-to-peer diagram, right? And peer-to-peer structure, I think, is essential for us to reconsider what an unarchival practice and its performatic gestures can do, or how they can be developed and unfold within the internet. Peer-to-peer, it's basically made out of seeders and leechers, which is, again, a very interesting way of connecting back to the land, right? Of the land and freedom that we were talking about some minutes ago. But in a way, what happens here, I think, is how can we create these smaller networks, right, made out of seeders and leechers, in order to sustain or to keep alive a very unorthodox archive, if you will. And these practices, when they emerged and gained popularity probably around 2006, 2007, right? The big popularity, I mean, not obviously the things that have been done from way before that time. It's very much about these infrastructures where we choose files to share with others. Therefore, we become a seeder. We have these seeds within our computer, and through these interfaces, these peer-to-peer interfaces, we allow for others in other places who are looking for this material that we have in our collection, if you will, to make a copy of this file and transfer it into their computers. This process of seeding and leeching from the peer-to-peer, I think, is a very interesting structure. First of all, because it's very much based in trust, right? And it's very much based in a community that is willing to share, that is willing to literally open their devices to others, right? With all of the issues and all of the dangers that could uphold. And I think this is a very, very interesting way of looking into the possibilities of archival practices on the internet. Not because this is necessarily something that's pioneering or new, but actually because of the opposite, because these particular peer-to-peer practices have been able to sustain a lot of the digital material that would otherwise be lost, right? That could otherwise be erased from these centralized monopolies that could very well just decide to make something disappear if it's something that they have already deemed worthless or useless, right? Or because of a mistake, or because of a whatever, hacking issue, right? So how do we regain agency of our files? How do we make them deletion-proof, right? I would argue that under these peer-to-peer structures, we could very well start working with something or develop something that could potentially become deletion-proof. And I want to show you an example of this. I want to show you this artwork by artist Julieta Gil. And again, even though she's not necessarily looking into a broader archival practice, this is definitely a strategy that we could be looking into for other potential archival practices, particularly the unarchival one. So in 2019, artist Julieta Gil was part of a feminist protest in Mexico City. This particular protest was very, very prominent in 2019 because a very large group of people gathered together in order to basically point the finger at Mexico City's authorities for being complicit in gender violence. And of course, like in many of these protests, some monuments and walls and houses within the public within the public space were tagged with graffiti and were tagged with names and logos and gestures and so forth, because that's really the use for these spaces, particularly of monuments, right? But obviously what happened afterwards, and this is part of like a larger critique, if you will, was that the first thing that the Mexico City government did right after the protest was to try and, how can I say it, to make this graffiti invisible by hiding it. And later on, of course, to refurbish or to restore the monuments to its original shape. But before doing that, this is obviously not the first time that this happens. This is obviously not the first time that the government, the Mexican government, tries to erase a social memory, particularly a social memory that is uncomfortable, that points out many issues within the government. So of course, artist Julieta Gil, she already knew that that's something that was going to happen. So before all of these becoming invisibilized once again, she decided to go to one of the main monuments in one of the main streets in Mexico City, Paseo de la Reforma, and create a 3D model of it, to digitize it. This is, well, one of the faces of this digitized monument. This monument is very emblematic for many reasons. It's very, very important. It's the Ángel de la Independencia, that's how we would call it, the Independence Angel. And it's very, I don't know, it's very ironic, right? On one hand, it is called, well, it's not the official name, but most people know it as the Independence Angel. And at the same time, it's the very first monument to be surrounded by the police and to be restored to its original shape, as if it could not hold social memory. So with that in mind, the artist came over. She, through a photogrammetry process, she digitized the monument in order to make it deletion-proof. So what she did with the digitized monument, which we can watch a small excerpt of this over here. What she did with this digitized monument, with this 3D model, was to make it available in her website. So you can go on and download the 3D model. Right here. You have all of the material that you need. It's an OBJ, so you can just go on, download it, and use it for whatever purpose you want, right? So something that I find very interesting is that obviously this is an artwork by this artist. This is part of her artistic practice and her body of work, but it is also part of a collective domain, right? So anyone could just get online, go into her website, download this 3D model, and use it for whatever other purpose, to reprint it, to intervene it, to glitch it, to house it elsewhere, to do a video mapping with it, to do whatever it is that you want to do. And even though we could say that there are some issues with that in terms of, like, you know, someone using it for a purpose that might not necessarily be the one that the artist would like it to have, at the same time, it becomes indestructible. So this has been, as you can see here, made into a video installation. It has been printed out. It has even been printed out in posters that have been used afterwards in other feminist protests. Or protest against gender violence. It has been used in other sorts of videos, right? It has been used for presenting many other things. And this is something that I think it just keeps expanding, and it keeps evolving in such a way that more and more, the more it is downloaded, the more it is remixed, the more it is reused, it becomes indestructible. And even though, again, this is not a particular archive, this is not something that could be deemed or conceived as an archive, this is definitely a structure that we could pursue for an unarchival practice to make something become deletion-proof, or to make something live for extended period of time. And here is something that I find very important, and it is the fact that we should always ask ourselves when we're digitizing something, and particularly when we are digitizing something and putting it up online, what is it that we're gaining by putting it online? What is it that we want to do with it? Here, I think the objective is quite obvious, right? She wants to make this monument in this specific moment in time live for an extended period of time. She knows that this monument is not going to remain like this. It's not going to hold this social memory of the protest and the graffiti that refer to this specific protest, but rather that it will be stripped from it and returned into its original shape in probably a couple of days. And then what, right? What happens with all of these memories around this particular action? So something that I find very compelling here is the ways in which the transition into this online strategy allows for it to live for a longer period of time. And it's very much because of the community that downloads, remixes, glitches, re-uploads, works around with this content, that this is possible, right? And again, this is just one of many potential ways of rethinking the unarchival practice. Another one, perhaps somewhere between a more traditional practice, could be seen with the Copiona project. This is more of a project that looks into text-based practices, where you get to download, reprint, submit, and resubmit content to Copiona, which is an Argentinian project that hosts, this content, and that allows for others to, again, very much like Julieta, download, remix, reprint, even resell in this particular case, these contents that exist online, right? They have various areas that allow for the access to these contents, way beyond notions of copyright, even very much pairing with the Creative Commons or copyleft movement that understand that some of this knowledge, as it falls outside of the hegemonic categories, or as it falls outside the, let's say, quote unquote, projects that are deemed worth by certain institutions, and particularly government-funded institutions in this case, what they allow is for these other ideas to emerge, to be distributed, to be taken care of, and to be, in a way, shared and pursued by others as well. Just a couple more examples before we can jump into our conversation and Q&A. This is also a project that has to do, in this particular case, it's also a social memory. It's part of a project by Acervos Digitais, which is a project that emerges in Brazil, where they, as you can see here, they created this database, they call it this navigation interface, that shows a specific moment in time within the contemporary political movements in Brazil. In this case, I think it is very important to have a look at why we're looking at a specific date in time, as it says over here, navigation interface for more than 500 hours of videos from Palacio do Planalto on January 8, 2023. These images come from 33 surveillance cameras and were made available by the GSI by order of the Federal Supreme Court. When browsing by time, you browse all the videos at a chosen time. This makes it possible to obtain an overview of the movement of the mob throughout the palace on January 8, 2023. So what happened in this specific moment in time is it was a mob, it was a alt-right or extreme right protest that attacked this specific building, claiming that the elections were not just, right? And this is again, this is something that has been very, very interesting, because we get to see, maybe not in real time anymore, but we get to see the evidence. We get to see the actual material of what's going on in a specific social memory, how it unfolded, right? And we get access to all of this material by scrolling and strolling around, right? And then we become also witnesses of this specific moment in time. We become witnesses of a history, we become witnesses of a social memory that, as we know, unfortunately, in Latin America, many, many times we can see that these are precisely the social memories that sometimes the media or the government or other hegemonic powers at play don't want us to access, don't want us to have a look into, because then what happens is that we get to fill in the pieces of the puzzle, right? We get to actually make a case, or to make an opinion, or to form an informed opinion about a specific event in this case. And again, I think that by doing this, by releasing and allowing us to go back and forth in this specific day, in this specific building, and having a look into the official cameras, right? We get a sense, or we get a better sense of what happened back then and there. We get a specific sense of who is involved in what and how things unfolded. And then, again, we get to be witnesses of something that could otherwise not be known or seen. And I think this is very powerful as a strategy to create these other witnesses, to create these other forms of being part of, to evidencing something, to collectively build upon a memory, to make something deletion-proof, but also to make something available in such a way that we get to choose what is it that we're looking at. And for that, I think that these archival practices, like Andres Maximiliano Tello was saying, this is a way, or this is the way in which these archives allow for us to rewrite, reshape, and re-understand reality, and even to form other notions of realities as we go. So that's my talk for today. Thank you for bearing with me. And see you in a minute for the conversation and Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I will stop sharing screen now, and now we're going to the conversation, discussion, and Q&A. If you have any questions, you can already post in the comments. Yeah, I feel like there are lots of interconnection between the lecture performance and this talk. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And yeah, we can also see that behind Julia, there are lots of audience in person during this event. Yeah, so some points I would like to discuss with you is I think at least there are three really strong points between all of your talk. The first one is this idea of community. And the second one is you both mentioned anarchism. And the third one is I think in both of your talk, you talk about this idea of ground, land, and this land ownership that connected to colonial history. I think in this aspect, it's really connected to Taiwan because we also underwent multiple different colonization, and we also have this problem of land ownership in terms of Aboriginal tribes and all this diverse culture. So maybe the first question I would like you to share a bit more about this metaphor of the ground, and also I think in the lecture performance you mentioned this concept of sound mix sort of as a way to resist. So Daniela and Julia, maybe you can elaborate this point a bit more.
Thank you so much, Qianyun and Doreen, for the lecture. Yes, this was something that when we were preparing, it came as a continuation between our research and Doreen's research, which we thought it was very important. And in our case, the ground, the title was an idea that came from Julia. I don't know, Julia, if you want to give like a background of how is that phrase used now, or you prefer that I continue?
Well, that phrase actually has to do with another phrase that the current president from Argentina uses, and it's the forces of heaven. And I think I can get some help here to translate that. ¿Vos podés explicar qué son las fuerzas del cielo? Hi. This is a friend, curator Tania Puente, also from Mexico, living in Argentina. And what happens is that the president, I just don't want to say his name, indeed, but uses this phrase, las fuerzas del cielo. Yes. So as a contrast, we came with this
forces of the ground, no?
¿Vos podrías explicar algo?
Yeah, sure, like very biblical, or trying to affirm that he's the one, no, within the political context, that he was chosen to change the course of events in Argentina. And therefore, what Julia, I'm guessing, tries to do, like appealing to the forces of the ground, is more like a community humus stage, you know, where things are built together by the community as well as the changes.
Yeah, also maybe you can, because not everyone sort of knows that this president in a situation, maybe you can explain a bit more, because if I understand correctly, this president sort of deleted the culture sector in Argentina, right? So it's a bit like a Ministry of Culture disappeared, sort of, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so like when we got this invitation to work across and around these topics, we thought it was very important that we could bring the case of the CASo, the Center of Sound Art, because it was sort of
we temporarily lost her.
The resources for the
maybe
can you hear me?
Video for a while.
All right.
It's back, I think. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So we were experiencing real time the shortage of the resources in many ways, financially, spatially, and also the human resources for this center to continue alive in a way. And that's why Julia thought it was very important for us to share the situation with it, and which were the strategies that have been happening and active, not only since the actual government, but also from years ago, because in a way it's this situation talks about a longer context and historical context in Argentina, where there are cyclical crises. And according to, as we were saying in the lecture, according of what is the current tendency, is that also cultural institutions are affected and sort of like activated or deleted. And so that's why strategies as this one that we were sharing, like an archivist, that we called then an archivist strategy of creating sort of a parallel archive of all the material and activities that had been taking place in the CASo, was so necessary and was created. Just going back to your questions, Yan-Yun, yeah, in our lecture performance, we also talk about social percussiveness, which is also a concept that helps us to connect very well this idea of the forces of the ground, but also the personal archive of Julia. That Julia, as a sound artist, she had been also recording sort of sound landscape, the landscape in sound of different cultural manifestations or celebrations, etc. And so we thought it would be very interesting as well to articulate these two archives. On the one hand, a very personal archive and very domestic, and on the other hand, a very institutional, but as you could hear from our lecture performance, which also had an intention of being a more domestic archive. And so because Julia was working with these recordings from the street and from collective gatherings, we found this concept, social percussiveness, very accurate, because that's actually what is taking place and what happens in each of these social and collective gatherings. That is how one individual body becomes sort of a collective body and can express with much more force the necessity of a change, or the happiness, or the support or lack of support to something, to a decision that maybe like the government or a more bigger power is willing to do, and which will directly affect to the ground, no, to the people. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know if I would add anything else to that, but then when Doreen came with this idea of talking about the other archive, the agrarian archive, we thought it was a very interesting point, because also currently, and this is like interesting how we can like go back and forth in history, but even currently in Argentina, there are many parts of the land which are being now sold to international, yes, to the capital in a way, because we in the country, there's a lot of resources as lithium and things, which again bring us back to the digital, no, and digital materialism, and how this fights of who owns the land are even taking place as well in our country at the moment.
Yeah, I think we really have like a shared colonial history and this problem of land ownership. Maybe Doreen, you can share a bit more on these points that related to agrarian archive and digital materialism.
Of course. I would say that one of the main things here, or things that I find very relevant in this context, is the fact that the notion of an archive and how it builds reality is very much rooted in what we end up acknowledging as a formal archive, right? And I think that in a way, the agrarian archive in itself is a proof of how many of these individual or personal archives can eventually evolve into something else. And I think that that is the performative gesture that I really wanted to bring back into the conversation, because I think that sometimes when we talk about digital materiality, and particularly something that is made available through the internet, this fluidity or this performativity is easier to understand. But in a way, my point is also to say that it doesn't necessarily have to do with just the materiality that an archive holds or has, but actually the ways in which we can rethink what an archive is that allow that performativity to unfold, which in this particular example has to do with something that is being put together and in a way made out of different smaller archives and eventually evolve into a larger structure that sustains, in this case, land ownership within the country. And of course, it holds a lot of other political issues in between the archive in itself. But I think what is relevant to the conversation is how this is also, even though this is a, let's say, very formal, very institutional, government approved and whatever archive, it's still very much an archive that deals with a performativity. And I think there's a space of possibility there as well. And just to add up into that, and perhaps connecting back to the notion of anarchivism, there is something there that also relates with the fact that these are archives that are alive. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind, because the fact that these archives remain alive or are still performing in a way or unfolding throughout time also allow for not only different interpretations of what we consider an archival practice, but also the reconfiguration of archives in themselves. And I think that I've heard this a couple of times before in the context of talking about digital archives, but thinking about a dynamic archive is very important within this context, particularly because if digital materialities allow for different formats to emerge, meaning, again, videos, texts, sounds, and such, then the dynamic nature of the digital archive is very much embedded in its materiality, as well as it is embedded in the performativity of thinking around archives as a whole. And I think there's a lot of space for discussion and possibility, obviously, when we have that in mind, when we merge these two elements of, on one hand, a materiality that's fluid enough that it can become pretty much any element that we want to create with it, but also the performativity of archives in themselves, regardless of the materialities that they hold.
Yeah, I think this is also really central to this project that I want to sort of achieve in this curation. Because in part of this program, we had one day that we have a physical performance. So people have to be like in person and they are performing internet archives, counter archives in different way. And I think this central concept really resonated with both of your talks in the sense that because in a lecture performance, you talk about you mix sort of a more private individual archive with institutional and sort of a public archive. So it's a bit like when you give this archive materiality and a physical body, you sort of have a stand on the ground, and that's like sort of the starting point or forces of resistance in terms of how to decolonize, and also in the feminist theory when they talk about corporeality and digital corporeality, it really links to the politics of particularity. So you really know carrying a person, then you have to put body or material. So it's not like an abstract concept that floating in the cloud. It's like from cloud to ground. Yeah. So I think, I'm really glad that it all resonates with each other. And I think the second point I would like to bring about is like this spirit of community. I think that present in your work, also in the practice, in your previous practice, because I know Daniela did lots of participatory and community work, and I think this also related to the way in which CASo Sound Art Center, how they form, and I had a feeling that the community of this sound archive is like part of the archive. And as to Doring, I think you have this idea of open source and P2P infrastructure about internet community. So maybe you can all share a bit about this role of community in relation to archives. Yeah, who wants to go?
Okay, I don't know. I was just respecting the order. Is it okay if I go? Yes, so this is central, and as Xianyun explained, my practice has somehow focused in participatory art projects, community-based projects, or what we can call the collaboration between art and social practice. And maybe that is why when looking at this topic of archives and choosing to approach it through the concept or the framework of anarchivism, and when talking with Julia and understanding all this process of the CASo, I was all the time thinking that we should sort of highlight what are the gestures, no, that sustain an archive, and the reason why choosing this word gesture is because it brings us the body immediately. It's not only a movement, but it's also understanding what are the historical and cultural aspects that affect the way that a body moves. And so we were thinking a lot about what is necessary to continue, maintain, and take care of an archive. And of course, this can only be, as also Doreen was saying, it's only through collectivity and through community. I think I would just for me, it was very important that all the time when working with Julia, that it has been already I would say 5 months that we have been doing this project together. It was very important as well how we were all the time, or she was all the time talking with other members from the Sound Art Center to understand the different, how they would understand what we were doing, if it was okay, and so on. And also that's why for us it was so important to delve into these conversations that when you see the lecture performance, we chose conversations from various years ago when they were already thinking, how is that archive that they are creating? How do they want this archive to be? And why they don't want it to be personalistic in the sense that it's only what one person that it's directing the center at the moment wants it to be, but how can an institutional archive allow different narratives and different voices, and as well modifications, no? And this in a way appear to be like opposite concepts, like how can an institution that normally, and an archive that needs to take care of a document and of resources and should sort of maintain tradition, how can it allow as well movement and it to be dynamic, and going back to what Doreen was saying. But this, again, for me, it's very clear that it's through constant discussions and constant openness and creating these moments of discussion within the center as they were doing at that time. I like to think as well that in a way what we did with Julia, this idea of navigating and doing looking back to this archive is a way of also collectively maintain that archive active and alive and open it and sharing the story like we are doing now. It's also important for other viewers, and this possibility was amazing because we're sharing it with people from very different points of the world. So it's important for them as well to keep it alive in a way. I don't know, Julia, if you want to say something about that, but.
Well, I would like to tell about what happened more recently, and it's the fact that we used to have this Sound Art CASo was named Centro de Arte Sonoro while it was part of the state, and right now we decided as a team to change that as Sound Art Community, so that we can use as well this platform in social networks to share more things that are happening in different places in Latin America. So I think what happened these months working with Dani as well was the chance to give these other options to the project and all that things that already exist, and to continue on transmitting through different radios and sharing sharing other kind of stuff, being outside now of the state. But that's something that's happening right now. So Radio CASo might still ¿cómo se dice? Volver, return. Radio CASo might return in these other formats as a community project. So that's all I wanted to say.
That's really important because, as I said in the introduction of our annual curatorial topic this year in the framework of NetOpen, is called commoning. So commoning is like a way of collective governance and sort of find a way to build a community around our limited resources and share with other people. And it can resonate with this whole open source culture in digital cultures. Maybe Doreen can elaborate more. Yeah.
But I think that the very nature of particularly internet archives as a broader field is very much rooted in creating a smaller networks that allow for these other archives to emerge. And I think about it very much in terms of what for example, the peer-to-peer communities did and still do, right? But also even not only just the open source access or in a way reintroducing into the commons I don't know, pieces of code or elements that could belong to a more traditional archival sense, but also the ways in which, let's say, smaller niche communities, if you will, produce their own archives as a way of making themselves present within a larger conversation. And I think that the fact that there is, in a way, a very specific way of reintroducing into the commons something that a community finds important is very relevant in the context of online archives, right? Like, what is it that you want to share with others, in which context, and why is it relevant to that context? And I think a bit about even the project that I lead, Antimateria. A couple of years back, I introduced a cyber library, a ciberbiblioteca, that is part of the pedagogic resources that are available on this website. And it's very much just a folder with a bunch of texts regarding digital culture in a broader sense. And that is something that, although it started as a personal archive, say all of the PDFs and documents that I've gathered and that have been useful to me, eventually opened to become, say, a repository, a community repository of texts, not only that I have found relevant throughout time, but that other people has also found relevant throughout time. And it keeps feeding itself off of that. So in a way, even if it wasn't structured as a, let's say, as a formal archive of the platform or as a formal archive in a broader sense, the way in which it became, I would argue, an archive in itself is by introducing the original elements that I had in my personal archive into the commons, but also introducing these specific collection of texts into the commons by allowing others to share their own text within the context of this specific archive. And I think it's very interesting because it's recursive, right? It becomes an archive by being acknowledged by a community that also feeds this archive. So it's a cyclical series of exchanges.
Yeah.
And I think that that is something that it's interesting, specifically when you're dealing with a digital materiality, because that is not easy to do in other forms of archives, right? There's other layers that you have to go through from archives, for archives that exist outside of the screen. That it doesn't mean that it won't allow for new things to emerge within these archives, or even for a community around the archive to introduce new elements to this more traditional archive, but you will have to go through different stages that might not necessarily become, I don't know, like a space really for a community to feel that they don't have to previously validate something as relevant or as important or as meaningful to eventually become part of an archive. And I think that that is a very important difference, because it's very much rooted in trust.
Yeah.
And I think trust is something that is key for an online archive, not only to sustain itself and to feed in a way itself, but also in the ways in which we understand community, not only offline but also online, right? And I think that a lot of the conversation about even blockchain or decentralized technologies or technologies for decentralization is that they are very much rooted in trust, or at least within the discourse of these technologies, trust is at the very center of it. And I think that that is something that that is not necessarily responding to other forms of validation, right? It doesn't necessarily respond to a form of validation that is rooted in power structures, for instance. Trust works in a different way.
Yeah, it's like internet gives us like a tool to rebuild the mechanism of building trust. Otherwise, we kind of sort of rely on the government and this like traditional institutions for lives. Like there's a possibility of way out through these tools. Yeah, Danielle, you want to say something? No, okay, I thought you was. But yeah, so also like the audience and friends, if you want to ask questions, you can just raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. Then I will read the questions for you if you type there, or if you want to raise your hand, is also fine. And while we are waiting for the questions, we can maybe discuss a bit about this concept of anarchism that you both mentioned. Yeah, because I think it's a really powerful concept and I really resonate. But I think one of like two sort of common criticism about anarchism is like it's kind of romantic and radical, because in reality, most of the archive are funded by governments. Like, because you kind of need a whole organization and quite lots of funding to sustain. And also in another way, if it's an anarchic internet archive, there are problems, like you have too many data, and how can you make your filter and how can you exist? I mean, the idea of a flat structure of power is really good, but in reality it's a bit hard to execute. Yeah, so I just wondering what's your perspectives on these challenges of anarchism? Yeah.
If you want to go first, Doreen, this time better.
Okay. Yes, of course. And I think it's interesting because it brings me back to the case of the agrarian archive, right? Because it sounds very utopian. It sounds something that it's, you know, a tool for allowing, I guess, independence and agency and such. But at the same time, it's very much, I guess, thrown into an out of the law structure that becomes harder to regulate. And I would argue that specific tension between having something that can exist even if it's in this case sustained by the government, but that exists outside the regulations and the law, it is very romantic, and it responds to the anarchist practices that we're talking about, but it also poses other challenges. And these challenges are very, very similar to the ones that we were talking about in regards to trust and community and power structures, even if it comes from a, let's say, institutionalized archive. And I think what it's interesting here is more about how are we going to make an archive, or how to think an archive in a more flexible and open way in terms of who can participate of this archive, and who is being even represented within the archive, what kind of values are being presented within this within an archive, rather than a methodology, I would say. So the invitation of thinking about anarchivism is less about giving a step-by-step way of developing an archive, and more a way of thinking what could be an archive, because that's another layer of it. And obviously, when we think about internet practices, internet archival practices, that obviously can become very hard to sustain, precisely because if something is rooted in trust, and a community in a way is as open as it can, so that it can encompass many different types of participation and exchanges, again, like you were saying, it's something that can become easily unsustainable. But at the same time, I think that in this particular case, the temporalities in which we can understand an archival practice will be doing part of that filtering. What is it that remains relevant to a conversation when we reconnect or revisit it a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? So I would say that it's not that it's going to become more sustainable, but it can be reshaped or rethought as a filter that can allow for a simpler approach to an archive that lives on the internet when we think about it throughout a period of time. And that's another thing, right? That I think that anarchivism is also a good concept that allows us to think about the temporality of an archive. Does an archive need to remain the same forever? Does it even need to exist forever? When it transforms over time, can it be subdivided into smaller pieces that make it more manageable? Can it be redistributed through the network of people that have added up into this archive and become smaller personal archives instead of one big archive? Is this something that is always thought and always seen to be ephemeral, even if ephemerality covers, let's say, long period of time? And I think rethinking temporality is also very much part of the proposal of anarchivism, precisely because it's not necessarily a methodology. It allows for us to even wonder, why would we need an archive to exist in its original form forever? Is that even possible? No? Like, even when we consider that in traditional archival terms. And that's something that I think could be interesting to understand also within a community, because communities are also changing and reshaped throughout time. They don't remain the same. They can either grow or subdivide, or basically the same issue or the same thing that can happen to an archive. So if we consider this to be part of the conversation beforehand, or as the archive is emerging, I think that flexibility is what it's also gonna allow us to make it more sustainable as a practice, let's say.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really valid argument. Daniela, you want to say more about this?
Yeah, I would just, I thank you, Doreen. It was such an amazing answer. I will just, I think it's very, just like to highlight this idea that it's not a methodology, but it's just more like a framework that allows us to see different projects. Like today, Doreen presented 4 projects 1 from a different century, 3 contemporary. We're talking about something, what's happening with the CASo is happening right now or has happened this year. But we can learn from each other, and this sort of anachronism or this different form, like non-linear temporality that allows us, that anarchivism allows us to use or to as an approach, and also as an analysis. I think it's very important. I think it's like every case presents a different methodology. All of them are different, but what we would say is the point of common is that it's a community reappropriating a resource or reappropriating a document that it's still relevant to define themselves and to protect what they think they own and they want to keep, no? And how can we learn from those other examples? I think that this is also what it's very nice about this meeting here, that we are talking about a case in Argentina. Doreen is talking about the history of Mexico, and we are sharing it with you, that it's like very far away, but we experience similar situations, and we can use each other as a model. So yeah, I think I wouldn't add anything else than that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there's a question from the audience, Claudio, if I pronounce correctly, sorry. And the question is, how is the context in Asian countries? In Latin America, we are used to fragile and short-term initiatives. Yeah, I can maybe share a bit of the situation in Taiwan. So in the more long term, because we've colonized by many different places, like really long ago was a bit Dutch, Spanish colonization, and then Japanese colonization. And then we have this problem with China now. And so in every way, sort of, there's a sort of deleting social memories when we changed government. And in the more contemporary situation in terms of digital archive, we also are not so stable in a way that we had a digital platform that just sort of closed also this year. And also Digital Art Center, sometimes it constantly changed the staff and the organizer. Yeah, so it's also not so stable, but I think it's maybe a bit longer than Latin America. And when some institution close down, like there another organization are doing so. But in general, compared to like Central Europe, is really unstable. Yeah. And one of the other issues in Taiwan is like, it's a bit hard to research history because of this multiple colonization, so it's quite complicated. And previously, it's getting better, but our education also like not so good in terms of teaching histories. So even myself, you just need to take a lot of efforts and time trying to understand like different materials and archives. So sort of like a detective and trying to know what really happened and different voices. Yeah, that's also one of the reasons that I call this a project counter archive, because there are so many voices still like a bit up in the air. Yeah, Dania.
Thank you, Senyun. Yeah, I would just like, I think something that it's like common to all our contexts is how like this phrase that we were repeating in our lecture performance, how the past is the universe of the possible. I think this sort of, this phrase resumes everything. It's like the importance of having the possibility to archive, I think, in our context is in a way so that we are the ones that can write our histories, no? And we can be part of other histories and also rewrite history. Because also I was thinking about this term we were using, temporality. If we compare the lifespan of these archives, that is much shorter than what we could think it could be an archive held in the UK or in Central Europe. What does it mean? Like, what does it mean to have short-term archives? Maybe it also allows other complex ways of thinking, other more complex ways of being, but this doesn't mean that it's worst. And also this brings us to the other topic of why, at least in Latin America, most of our arts archives and collections are being held in Central Europe. So this is another form of power of controlling who writes our history and not being ourselves who can write that. Even in our cases, I think we all come from sort of art history backgrounds, and we studied not so long ago, and we were looking mainly at European art. And this is why, as well, with Julia, we decided it's so important, this phrase that we put. It's important that our art initiatives are as well archived, because if not, nobody will be speaking about that, no? And nobody can know about that. And I think that one other project that I would like to mention in relation to that is what Xianyun and I have worked in the past in relation to net art, which is the Latino net art database, which is also a very interesting project to look at, because it was basically an archive of all the net art works that were happening and being created in Latin America. And now if you go to that database, most of the links are not working. So that speaks a lot in itself of how is our history developing. But it's so important that we can at least look at that database. So yeah, just different examples.
Yeah, I think we really share the same history in terms of these lost archives. And I was wondering also, maybe we can sort of wrap up with this last point, but also if the audience, you want to raise hands or ask questions, we are still really welcoming. So this point I want to bring is this colonial history of net art, or generally speaking, how art or culture production can be ways of decolonizing, or as you say, even it's not decolonizing, but anti-colonization. Yeah, because if you look at the history of net art, usually you get two versions of what's the origins. One is Vukosik's myth of the origin of net art. And the other is from cyberfeminism. Also, Vukosik, he's from Slovenia, so it's Eastern Europe, if you say geographically. And the other version is the cyberfeminist collective VNS from Australia. Although they are both really self-reflexive, they're trying to make this narrative of it's anti-movement, so it's not like a Central European net art movement. And also cyberfeminism, they are really conscious of trying to make a manifesto that is antithesis. So it is not something instead of affirmative, or so in this way they make it not sort of kind of another origin or movement in net art, or create another art history canon. So, but in a way that when we trying to learn net art, we have to learn these two stories, but at least it's improving now. It's self-reflexive, not to mention all the art history we learned before. And I just wondering if there are other things we can do to try to change this. And if you or some comments.
Yeah, I can jump in, and actually I think that I can connect this with one of the questions that is here on the chat. That in a resumed version, the question is, what if the access to internet is limited? And I think this relates to net art histories in Latin America, and this relates as well to the ways in which we should also acknowledge the fact that when we talk about the digital, it doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about the internet. And I think that there's a space there for possibility. But before entering there, I think that there's something interesting in terms of the temporalities. And I've found this in many conversations about different indigenous communities, and is the ways in which temporality is understood as to how the past is in front of us and the future is behind us. And I think that that is very interesting, because that's a shared perception of time in many indigenous communities. And reconnecting with Dani's and Julia's performance, the fact that, you know, the past is the space for possibility is very much connected to that idea of the past being in front of us, because we can, in a way, not necessarily relive or resuscitate, if you will, certain elements, but we can definitely invoke some of them to bring them into the present, and potentially then again into the future, right? Particularly through archival practices, but not necessarily just linked to those. I think a lot about this because that's part of my field of expertise. I work a lot around media arts histories, and of course, net art being one of these fields within media arts. I think it's interesting because, again, the ways in which many artists have reflected upon their practices on the internet, in this case, has been through understanding the ephemerality of it. And that's also a way to link it into the performatic gestures that I was trying to present within my lecture, which is that when we talk about, for instance, performance practices of the 60s, and we think about specifically happenings, right? Happenings in the very westernized sense is a series of performatic gestures that are not meant to be documented in any form of or shape, and that just exist in a specific moment in time. But it doesn't mean that these specific practices are not able to be archived in a form or shape that doesn't necessarily involve the original materiality, but the testimonies of those who were part of these events. So we access these artworks that were not meant to be documented through the voices of other people. And I think that happens a lot with net art practices as well, and particularly within Latin American net art practices. So, of course, the Net Art Latino database, that it's a part of the broader artistic practice and work and research of Brian McKern. And the fact that we can still access a list of links that, even though they are not open or accessible to the public anymore, we can still get a sense of the names and the approaches that certain practitioners had. It's very much about this happening-like structure, right? We might not be able to access the artwork, but we could definitely be able still to these days to access what other people experience within these artworks through other forms of documentation, which is more, again, through the community, through the people who saw these artworks and who can share what they experienced, even if it's not a perfect account of what happened there, because we're all gonna forget, you know, the fine details, if you will. But as the testimonies grow and the people involved in reliving these experiences get together, that's how we can still make this appear or come back to life. And I think that that is very important as well within the question of access. And I just want to bring back one example of this by the work of Nestor Siré and Stephen Kohn. Nestor Siré works particularly in the histories of Cuba, and specifically he has an artwork and a research practice that explores the SNet community in La Habana. And the SNet community is basically a community that makes accessible a sort of intranet infrastructure that is led by the community in itself. So it's not the access to the internet, it's not the, let's say, the World Wide Web, but it's a intranet that can be collectively sourced and shared within, in this case, La Habana. And through part of these structures, they have one specific thing that's called El Paquete Semanal. And El Paquete Semanal is basically, I think it's, I can't remember the amount of information that it contains, but weekly what they would do is that they would create folders with files on them fed by people who have access to the internet, and then redistribute that as a hard drive that is shared with members of the community who are interested in this. And they can just literally just drag and drop whatever it is that they find interesting or useful from this hard drive. So Nestor Siré coordinated a folder that is an art folder that contains digital artwork that you can access and download directly to your devices. And again, this is not something that is connected to the internet. This is something that might come from people who have access to the internet, download these contents, restructure them in these folders, and then allow for other people to access the contents of these folders by themselves. And this can be done through, let's say, the shared experience of accessing them through a cybercafe, a space where you can go and rent per hour a computer with either access to the internet or ideally, but if in this case you don't have access to the internet, you can still pay for accessing a computer where you can access these digital files. So there's a lot of ways around that. And I think that that particular example is very, very fascinating because it is a network of people inside and outside Cuba that are sharing files and then redistributing these digital files to other people. We could argue that every single edition of El Paquete Semanal that has ever existed is an archive in itself, a living archive. I don't know, I'm sure that there might be someone who has all of the weekly editions of El Paquete Semanal somewhere. Maybe Nestor himself has that. But I think it is very fascinating because you can see all of these elements being put together. So bypassing, in this case, censorship, bypassing the no accessibility to the internet. And also, let's remember that Cuba has a big blockade, so they cannot access US internet as in many, well, in some Asian countries happens as well, like in China, for instance, no? Or obviously Russia and the Arab Emirates and so forth. So Cuba cannot also, even with access to the internet, they can't also access to many of these websites. So by bypassing these through literally hand-to-hand hard drives that are being copied and replicated, it's a very, I would say it's a very beautiful analogy to how the internet actually works, even if in a smaller scale. And I think that's the trick, right? We can think about it in a smaller scales and be able to reproduce these elements that then become a good way of bypassing a lot of these issues. I don't know, I just think that El Paquete Semanal is a fantastic example of that in many ways. And it's, again, it's not even just for art, it's also people who are from medicine to food to any other thing that people might need within Cuba. So it's a lot of things. So it's entertainment, it's art, it's basic needs, resources, it's manuals, it's recipes, it's everything on a weekly basis. I just think that's absolutely fascinating for many reasons.
Yeah, so it's like an example of physical low-tech internet that built by communities and trusts So it's like a dynamic, performative archive. And I think this also answered questions from this, the erasing of Hong Kong and archive. And yes, so Wani said that, can you send us the name of the Cuban artist and the project you mentioned? Yeah, we can put it there. Yes, that's great. So if Tanya, Doreen want to say some final words or some comments you wanted to say but haven't had a chance, or Julia, yeah. Okay. Yeah, you can say.
Okay. No, I think that example that Doreen said is amazing, but also just a final reflection about that it can be thought of something romantic and utopian, but it talks very clearly about the scales, no? Like today, the way we use internet and the way we use social media, it's like the way in which we think we know if something is having impact is only through a quantitative measure. And if we would analyze this project only through a quantitative lens, we would say this is not working, like this is a fracaso. I don't know, like, yeah. And so, but I think with all these projects, we need to, are examples for us to remember that these more short, small scale exchanges sustained are so important. And which at the end, it's like those examples that will also inspire us to work through complex moments. During dictatorship in Argentina, there were so many as well projects of what was called Arte Correo, that it was mail art, that were also ways of sharing information so that they could bypass censorship, and thus that was only through post mail. And so many of these examples, I think that they talk about what we can do now and these alternatives and like different strategies that I think are still very relevant. Just that, and I wanted again to express how happy we are of participating of these projects within the museum and of sharing as well all our research with Doreen, that I think it has been a very enlightening combination and articulation of thoughts. Please feel free to contact us if you have more questions in the future. We're very happy to know that this will be still streaming in the museum, in the Taipei Fine Arts Museum. And we hope to see you everybody soon. I don't know, Julia, if wants to add something from the headquarters.
No, just I'm very grateful, really, really grateful. Thank you. And well, I'm here in this place called Casa Belgrado, which is a space for residencies in Argentina. And so very glad that friends and colleagues came, and also just want to thank you very much, all of you and workers from the museum. And we've enjoyed it a lot. It's very important for us to have the chance to talk about this. And well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
Yes, really, thank you for all the staff in the museum and all the speakers. And also, I'm really glad because I think actually you three didn't know each other before this project. So I really hope that we can all collaborate together and form a community in the future. Thank you very much for joining us today. See you.